I have stood on a moon where the atmosphere bleeds acid and watched a creature the size of a city block decide I was not worth eating. I have floated in dead space, suit cracked, oxygen at 11%, while something ancient and eyeless circled me the way water circles a drain, patient, certain, inevitable, and I talked it down. Talked it down. With my voice and my hands and 43 words in a language I had learned in 6 hours from a dying diplomat. I have walked into Vethkar war councils where the temperature alone could boil blood, and I walked out with a treaty folded in my chest pocket and 3 new scars I don't talk about. None of it broke me. None of the monsters. None of the wars. None of the 1,000 ways the galaxy invented to remind organic life that it is small and brief and mostly mistake. None of it. And then I met humans. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say terrified. I do not mean the terror of the Grethal ambush on Station 9, where I lost 4 crew members in under 2 minutes and could not do anything except keep moving because stopping was dying. That terror had a shape. It had a source. It had an end. What humans did to me had none of those things. It had no shape, no source I could locate, no one I could plan for. The first human I ever spoke with at length looked at me across a medical bay table, both her legs in reconstruction sleeves, a cup of something hot balanced on her knee, and she laughed at something I said about mortality statistics. Laughed. I have never recovered from that moment. I have tried. I have cross-referenced it against 67 xenopsychology journals. I have consulted with 3 separate species who had long diplomatic histories with humans before I did. They all said the same thing, more or less. Good luck with that. This is not a story about the monsters I fought across the galaxy. You will hear about them because they are part of it, because you cannot understand what humans did to me without first understanding what I thought I knew about fear. This is a story about the thing I was not prepared for, and I was prepared for everything. Commander Voskale had a system. Every species he had ever encountered in 22 years of interstellar diplomatic corps service went into the system. He built it himself, over years, adding and refining and cross-checking until it was less a database and more a second mind. A map of the galaxy written in behavioral patterns and threat assessments and the small but critical details that kept diplomats alive when the talking stopped and the something else began. The Grethal, for instance. 6 limbs. Hierarchical aggression pattern. Never make eye contact with the eldest in a group unless you want it to be understood as a direct challenge. Respond to any territorial display with a precise 40-degree lateral bow. Weight on the back foot. Keep your hands visible and open at all times. Never eat in their presence unless invited, and if invited, eat everything offered and do not show any facial expression of discomfort no matter what it was, because discomfort read as insult, and insult among the Grethal had a way of escalating in the direction of bloodshed. Voss had learned that particular rule on his 3rd assignment. He had the scar behind his left ear to prove it. The Vel-SEK were trickier. Hive intelligence, partial. They had individual thought, but group emotion, which meant any single Vel-SEK he spoke to was simultaneously processing the emotional state of up to 800 others in the colony network. Standard rule of thumb. Keep the meeting short, keep the room calm, never introduce a new variable without 30 seconds of warning, and always exit at a 45-degree angle from the door, so the exit read as retreat rather than escape. The Vel-SEK word for escape and the Vel-SEK word for aggression were the same sound in 2 different registers, and the registers were very close together. Voss had learned that on his 7th assignment. He carried a Vel-SK diplomatic token in his left breast pocket every day since, not as a souvenir, but as a reminder of how close 45 degrees and 44 degrees were from each other. He had files like this for 69 species. Some files were 3 pages. Some were the length of a small novel. The human file, when he first created it 26 months ago in preparation for his assignment to the Joint Accord Station where human presence had recently been formally recognized, was 4 sentences long. Bilaterally symmetrical. Mammalian. Emotionally variable. Handle with contextual flexibility. *4 sentences. He had thought that was enough. He had thought contextual flexibility was a strategy. He had been wrong about that in a way he still could not fully quantify. The first thing Voss noticed about the humans on Accord Station was the noise, not volume. The station had beings aboard who communicated in frequencies that made the walls vibrate, but the particular quality of human noise, the way it layered, the way it overlapped, the way two humans could be having what every acoustic and tonal sensor read as a conflict, and then one of them would make a sharp sound, a bark almost, and they would both relax. The tension would dissolve. They would touch each other on the arm or the shoulder, sometimes on the face, and walk away in apparently improved spirits. Voss spent a full week reviewing sensor footage of this before he flagged it in his report. Human vocalization patterns appear to serve dual aggressive and social bonding functions simultaneously. Further study required. Asterisk's supervisor, an Alvani named Tereth with 60 years of xenodiplomacy behind her, read the report and sent back a single line. Yes. Welcome to humans, Kale. Further study will not help. He filed that response under unhelpful and continued studying. His first formal meeting with a human diplomat was with a woman named Dr. Yara Osei. She was the Human Accords attaché to the Diplomatic Coordination Council, a position that in any other species representation would be held by their most controlled, most formal, most rigidly protocol-trained member. The attaché was the face. The attaché was the first impression. Voss had held that same position 14 years ago, and he had trained for 3 months on how to present stillness, how to give nothing away, how to make every other species in the room feel that the entity across from them was comprehensible and safe and operating by the same invisible rules they were. Dr. Osei walked into the first council session 12 minutes late. This alone was not remarkable. Some species ran on biological time cycles that didn't map cleanly to station standard, but Dr. Osei was carrying what appeared to be a food and beverage container, the kind sold at the lower-level commissary, and she was still drinking from it when she took her seat. She looked around the table, made eye contact, direct, sustained, entirely unmodulated eye contact, with each person present, and said something in trade standard that Voss's translator rendered as, "Sorry I'm late. The line for coffee was absurd. Has anyone briefed on the Neth Sector item yet? Or do we need to catch me up?" Not a question. Or it was a question, but it didn't end the way questions ended. It landed flat, like a statement that expected an answer anyway. The VelSEK representative made a small sound that indicated social disorientation. The Grethau representative went very still in the way that, in Voss's experience, preceded either a territorial display or a nap. It was difficult to tell with Grethau. The Alvani, sitting beside Voss, leaned 3 degrees to the left, which was the Alvani equivalent of sharp inhale. Voss looked at his notes. He looked at Dr. Osei. He looked at his notes again. He said, carefully, that the Neth Sector item had not yet been introduced, and that her tardiness, while noted, would not require formal documentation if the remainder of the session proceeded without incident. Dr. Osei looked at him. She had a specific kind of looking that he would come to recognize over the following months, a quality of attention that felt like being read rather than seen, like she was processing something behind her eyes that he didn't have the codec for. She did this for approximately 2 seconds. Then she smiled. Not a diplomatic smile. Not the particular careful arrangement of facial musculature that every trained attaché in every species deployed when they needed to signal non-aggression without warmth. A real smile. The kind that moves the tissue around the eyes. The kind that was either an expression of genuine positive affect or the most sophisticated social weapon Voss had ever encountered, and he genuinely could not tell which. She said, in a tone that his translator labeled as lightly ironic, function unclear, asterisk noted. Thanks, Commander. Asterisk she knew his rank. She had not been introduced to him yet. She had done her reading. He added a 5th line to the human file. Dr. Yara Osei appears to operate by different rules. Identify the rules before next meeting. Asterisk he never identified the rules. He identified patterns. He was very good at patterns, 22 years of survival across 69 species was essentially a masterclass in pattern recognition, but patterns require a stable baseline, and Dr. Osei did not have one. Or rather, she had one, but it was buried under so many layers of what Voss could only describe as deliberate contextual disguise that the baseline kept moving. She was formal when he expected informal, informal when he expected formal. She cracked what his translator identified as humor in sessions where the VLSEK were already running close to their social overload threshold. And the humor worked. It deflated the pressure in the room with a precision that looked accidental, but very clearly was not. She went completely silent in sessions where every protocol indicated she should speak, and when she finally did speak in those sessions, whatever she said moved the entire room in the direction she wanted. Once, during a particularly difficult negotiation over resource allocation in the Keth corridor, she said nothing for 40 minutes. 43 minutes, actually, Voss counted. The Grethal block was running hot. The Alvani were withdrawing into their formal language, which was always a bad sign, and everyone in the room was waiting for someone to break in a way that would have to be papered over with 3 weeks of follow-up correspondence. Dr. Osei sat with her hands flat on the table, looking at the center of the space between the two most tense parties, and said nothing for 43 minutes. Then, she said 7 words that Voss did not catch fast enough to record, and the Grethel eldest made the sound that indicated formal reconsideration, and the Alvani sat forward, and the negotiation resumed. After the session, Voss asked her what she had said. She looked at him with that reading look. She said, "I told them they were both right, and that was the problem." He stood with that for a long moment. He said, "That does not resolve the resource dispute." She said, "No. But it gave them something to agree on. You can negotiate with agreement. You can't negotiate with 2 people who each think the other one is wrong." She left before he could respond. He stood in the hallway for a while. Then he went back to his quarters and spent 3 hours revising the human file, which by that point was no longer 4 sentences long, but had expanded into something that was less a diplomatic briefing and more an ongoing admission of his own confusion. 3 months into his assignment, there was an incident. The word incident was a diplomatic euphemism for what it actually was, which was a Grethal junior attaché misread an Alvani proximity gesture as a territorial claim, and responded with a preliminary aggression display. And before Voss could implement the standard de-escalation protocol, a very specific sequence of actions that he had performed successfully 11 times across his career, Dr. Osei stepped between the 2 parties. She did not use de-escalation protocol. She did not use the lateral bow. She did not use the careful trade standard phrasing that the protocol manual recommended. She stepped between them, put one hand up in the universal halt gesture that somehow every species with bilateral upper limbs seemed to have independently developed, and said something so fast that Voss's translator struggled. It came back fragmented. "Enough, both of you. Not here, not today. Take a breath." The Grethal junior attaché went still. Not the stillness before a territorial display. Not the nap stillness. A different stillness. The kind that, in Voss's experience, he had only ever seen one thing produce in a Grethal. The stillness of encountering something that did not map to any existing category. The Alvani stepped back. Dr. Osei stood in the space between them. She was not particularly large for a human. She was, by the objective measures Voss had catalogued, completely physically unintimidating. She had no defensive adaptations that his scans had identified. No threat display. No weapons. She just stood there, and both parties backed down. Later, in the debrief, Voss asked his Alvani colleague Ren what had happened. Ren was old and had more experience with humans than anyone else on station. Ren said, she had no fear response. Both parties checked for it. It wasn't there. Voss said, she wasn't afraid. Ren said, very carefully, that is not what I said. I said the fear response was not there. Whether the fear was there is a different question. When I have spent 11 years asking about humans, and I still do not have an answer for. Voss went back to his quarters. He sat at his desk for a long time. He opened the human file. He deleted everything he had written and started again. Not because the observations were wrong, because he was beginning to understand that he had been asking the wrong questions from the start, and that was a much larger problem than he knew how to solve with a database. The galaxy had taught Voss that every dangerous thing announced itself. The Grethal had their displays. The Velesek had their frequency shifts. The creatures he had encountered on 24 airless moons, and in 3 documented contact events with genuinely unclassified life, had always given him something to read. Some signal, some behavioral grammar that told him, here is the shape of this danger. Here is what it wants. Here is what will make it stop. 22 years of staying alive in the galaxy's worst rooms was essentially 22 years of learning to read those signals fast enough to respond before they became irreversible. He had been so good at it. He had been so reliably, methodically good at it that he had stopped being afraid of dangerous things somewhere around year 8, in the particular way that expertise kills a specific kind of fear. The fear of the unknown dissolves when you can make the unknown known fast enough, when your pattern recognition is faster than the danger. Dr. Yara Osei gave him no signal he could read. She was not dangerous in the way dangerous things were dangerous. She was not a threat. Every assessment he ran said the same thing. Cooperative, professional, effective, occasionally in violation of minor protocol. No threat profile. No concerning behavioral markers. And yet, he could not stop trying to read her. He could not stop running the assessment and getting back cooperative, professional, effective, and feeling like the assessment was missing something vast and critical. Like he was reading a map that showed him the roads, but not the terrain. He lay awake on the 4th night of his 3rd month on station, running what he had. The coffee at the first meeting. The 43 minutes of silence. The hand going up between 2 aggressive parties with no fear response showing. The 7 words he had not caught fast enough. The smile that moved the tissue around the eyes. The way she looked at him like she was reading something he wasn't showing. He thought about Ren's distinction. Fear response not present. Whether fear was present, unknown. He thought about the Grethal Junior attaché, going still. Not the aggressive still. Not the nap still. The new category still. He thought about the fact that he, Voskale, 22 years, 69 species, survivor of the Grethal ambush, and the Velesek proximity incident, and the contact event on the moon that he did not talk about, the man who had made a system out of survival. He thought about the fact that he had been lying awake cataloging a diplomat who drank commissary coffee and showed up 12 minutes late, and that this was more cognitively consuming than any monster he had ever faced. He added one more line to the human file. He thought about it for a long time before he wrote it, because writing it felt like admitting something. He wrote anyway. I do not know what I am looking at. This is new. Month 4 began with a crisis that had nothing to do with humans and everything to do with what happened when humans were nearby while the crisis was occurring. The Keth Corridor Resource Negotiation, the one Dr. Osei had redirected with 7 words Voss hadn't caught in time, had moved to a second stage, and the second stage required a joint inspection team traveling to the corridor itself. 3 ships, 6 species, 14 diplomatic personnel, including support staff. 2 weeks in transit through a sector that was, diplomatically speaking, contested in a way that made insurance companies on 3 different worlds charge premium rates for any craft passing through. Voss was the senior corps representative on the mission. Dr. Osei was the human block's ranking member. He had prepared extensively. He had briefed on the transit protocols, the inspection procedures, the chain of communication for any incident that might occur en route, the cultural accommodation requirements for having 6 species in close quarters for 2 weeks, the conflict resolution hierarchy for any interpersonal incident between crew members. He had a document for every scenario he could construct. He had not constructed the scenario where the transit took 9 hours longer than planned because the lead ship's navigation array clipped an uncharted debris field, and they spent most of ship day limping through it at 40% capacity while every diplomatic representative aboard processed their particular species' relationship to uncertainty and confinement in close proximity. Grethal did not do well with uncertainty. Their behavioral pattern under prolonged uncertainty was a controlled aggression cycle. They externalized. They found something to push against. In close quarters with no appropriate target for the aggression, this tended to create incidents. The VLSEK colony representative had 312 others in her network processing the exact sensory data she was processing, which meant the ship effectively contained 312 VLSEK, all experiencing confinement simultaneously, and the emotional overflow from that was starting to bleed into her biometric readings in a way that Voss was watching on his monitor with growing concern. The two Alvani representatives had gone formal. Full formal. The restricted register that meant they were protecting themselves from social information overload, which was the Alvani equivalent of pulling up a drawbridge. They would not be useful for anything interpersonal until the formality broke. Voss was managing 4 additional species simultaneously and trying to run the communications with the engineering team while keeping half an eye on the Grethal tension levels and the VLSEK biometrics, and also writing a situation report that his supervisor Tereth had requested and would require, knowing Tereth, 3 follow-up clarification questions regardless of how thorough Voss made it. He was in the middle of the situation report when Dr. Osei sat down across from him. She did not say anything for a moment. She put a mug on the table. Commissary, again, she seemed to have a personal relationship with the commissary, and looked at his screens without commenting on them. Then she said, "What do you need from me right now?" Not, "What's happening?" Not, "Can I help?" Not, "How is the situation?" The specific, operational question. What did he need? From her. Right now. He looked at her. He had the familiar sensation of the reading happening behind her eyes, and this time he made a deliberate choice to let it happen instead of trying to figure out its mechanism. He said, "Asterisk, the Grethal cluster in Bay 2 is at aggression threshold, and I cannot leave this console to implement de-escalation. The VLSEK representative is approaching emotional saturation, and I have flagged it, but the only appropriate response is a reduction in ambient stimulation that I do not currently have the personnel to coordinate." Asterisk, she picked up her mug. She said, "Asterisk, I'll take the VLSEK. Who do you have for the Grethal?" Asterisk, he said, "The protocol for Grethal de-escalation requires." She said, "Who do you have?" Pause. He looked at his personnel list. He said, "Asterisk, my second, Ilver. He is trained, but he has not implemented the protocol in a live scenario." Asterisk, she said, "Asterisk, walk him through it from here while I handle the VLSEK. Can you do both at once?" Asterisk, he said, "Yes." She stood up. She took her mug. She said, "Tell me when a VLSEK situation is resolved so I can come back, and you can brief me on the second stage inspection timeline, because I have thoughts about the scheduling that I should have raised in the last session, and didn't." She walked toward the VLSEK representative's compartment. Voss watched her go. Then he called Ilver and started walking him through the protocol, and he kept half his attention on the VLSEK compartment on the monitoring feed, and he watched Dr. Osei do something with the ambient light controls and something else with the acoustic dampeners that his feed didn't fully capture, and 20 minutes later the VLSEK biometrics started dropping back towards stable. The Grethal situation resolved in 35 minutes. Ilver had been good. Better than good. The crisis had forced him to actually inhabit the protocol rather than perform it, and there was a version of Ilver who had come out the other side of that bay better at his job than he'd gone in. Dr. Osei came back. She sat down across from him again. She picked up her mug, found it empty, made a face that his translator labeled as mild displeasure, non-critical. She said, "Asterisk, okay. Scheduling." Asterisk, he said, "Wait." She waited. He said, "How did you know the acoustic dampeners would help?" She looked at him with a reading look. She said, "I read the VLSEK file." He said, "The core file is classified at a level you don't." She said, "Asterisk, not your file. Theirs." The VLSEK Academic Exchange Program puts colony experience papers in their public archive. One of their researchers wrote about sensory management in transit 7 years ago. The acoustic finding was in the supplemental materials, asterisk silence. He said, "You read Vel SEK academic papers." She said, "Asterisk, I read everything I could find about every species I might work with. That's the job." Asterisk, he looked at her for a long time. He said, "Asterisk, that is, in fact, also my job. And I did not know about the acoustic finding." Asterisk, she shrugged. One shoulder, a human gesture he had logged as indicating something in the range of acknowledged, but not important. She said, "Asterisk, your file is probably better on the operational stuff. Mine is better on the science. Between us, we have a pretty good picture. Can we talk about the scheduling now?" Asterisk, between us, we have a pretty good picture. He filed that phrase in a part of his mind that was not the human file, and was not the database, and was not the system, and he did not examine it until much later. He said, "Asterisk, yes. Talk about the scheduling." Asterisk, the 9-day inspection itself produced 2 additional incidents. 1 cross-species miscommunication that required 4 hours of mediation, 3 violations of minor inspection protocol that Voss had to document, and Dr. Osei had to countersign, and 1 event on the 5th day that Voss had no diplomatic category for, and spent the remainder of the trip trying to find one. The 5th day event, a Grethal senior inspector, not part of the original diplomatic delegation, assigned locally to the inspection, made a formal challenge gesture toward a human technical officer named Sergeant Marcus Webb, who had the misfortune of being in the wrong corridor at the wrong time and apparently failing to perform the correct response to the Grethal challenge display. Voss was not present when it started. He arrived 40 seconds after the initial report came through his comm, which was 40 seconds later than he wanted to be, but was, given the geometry of the station they were inspecting, as fast as physically possible. What he arrived to, Sergeant Marcus Webb, standing very still, hands at his sides, looking at the Grethal inspector with an expression that Voss's training categorized as calm, but that had something underneath it that didn't categorize cleanly. The Grethal inspector was in full display posture. 3 of its limbs were extended, which was 2 past the threshold for preliminary challenge and into active territorial assertion. Dr. Osei was there. She had arrived before Voss. She had been in an adjacent corridor, and she was standing slightly behind and to the left of Sergeant Webb. Not in the Grethal's direct line of sight. Not imposing, just present. She was watching Sergeant Webb. Voss began moving toward the correct position to initiate de-escalation protocol. He caught Dr. Osei's eye. She made a very small gesture, a fraction of a movement with 2 fingers, that his body read as, "Wait." He stopped. He did not know why he stopped. The gesture had not been in any protocol manual he had ever read. Sergeant Marcus Webb opened his mouth and said something to the Grethal inspector in a voice that was too low for Voss's translator to catch clearly. And then he did something that Voss had never seen a non-Grethal do in an active territorial display situation. He held the eye contact, not the accidental eye contact of someone who didn't know the protocol. Not a challenge. Something else. Something that lasted exactly long enough. And Voss would rerun his own memory of this moment many times over the following weeks, trying to understand how Webb had known exactly long enough. And then released, and then Webb dipped his head in a motion that wasn't quite the 40-degree bow, but had something of it more organic, less mechanical, and said something else that the translator got most of. Asterisk, I hear you. Not here. Asterisk, the Grethal inspector held display posture for 4 more seconds. Then it withdrew the 2 extended limbs. Not all 3, not a full stand down, but enough. Enough to turn it from active territorial assertion back to preliminary challenge, which was a significant de-escalation in about 8 seconds. Voss finished the protocol from that point. It took 3 minutes. The Grethal inspector was fully de-escalated in 5. There was paperwork. Later in the corridor, he found Dr. Osei and said, "Where did Sergeant Webb learn that?" She said, "Bar fight," he said. "I am sorry." She said, "Asterisk, he grew up in a city with a lot of different people and spent some time in places where reading the room fast was the thing that kept you from getting hurt. He transferred that. A lot of humans do." Asterisk, he said, "Transfer." She said, "Take a skill from one context and apply it somewhere it technically doesn't belong but sort of does anyway. He stood with that for a moment. He said, "That is a form of learning I do not have a category for." She looked at him. She said, "What category do you use?" He said, "Acquired specific competency, which requires formal instruction in the specific domain." She made the one-shoulder shrug. She said, "We mostly just throw ourselves at things until something sticks. It's messy, but it generates a lot of weird edge cases." She said, "Weird edge cases the way another person might say a feature, not a bug." And he was starting to understand that this was not an accident, that her language was very rarely an accident, and that understanding this was both useful and disorienting in a way he didn't have vocabulary for. He said, "Does it not bother you? The throwing, the not knowing if something will stick?" She looked at him with a reading look. The real one held longer than usual. She said, "Get used to." Then I decided that being bothered by it was a waste of the time I was spending throwing myself at things. She walked away. Voss stood in the corridor for a moment. Then he followed because they had a debrief to run and because he was beginning to understand, slowly, imprecisely, in a way that large understandings arrive, which is all at once, but only after a long, slow build. That following was not capitulation. It was data collection. He was still telling himself that for 3 more weeks. It took him that long to admit that it had stopped being entirely true around the time. She said, "Between us, we have a pretty good picture," and he had not corrected her use of the word us. The incident that cracked something open in Voss's system happened not during a crisis, but during a meal. A meal. He had eaten thousands of meals across 22 years of assignment, always with the careful awareness of which species he was eating with, and what the consumption protocols were, who ate first, what foods carried social meaning, what it meant to accept or refuse a shared dish. He was good at meal protocol. He had never had a meal that did things to his understanding of the universe. Dr. Osei found him in the commissary on the last night of the inspection trip. He was eating alone, because after 9 days of intense cross-species coordination, he needed the silence the way a cracked hull needs pressure equalization. Urgently, and for survival. She sat down across from him with her own tray and said, "You're doing the thing." He said, "What thing?" She said, "The recharge thing. You need to be alone to process," and I sat down, and now you're calculating whether it's more exhausting to tell me that or to just be here with me for a while. He looked at her. He said, "How do you know that?" She said, "Because I do the same thing, and you look exactly like I feel when someone sits down during recharge time." He said, "And yet you sat down." She said, "Because I also know that sometimes what feels like needing to be alone is actually needing to be with someone quiet. And I could be quiet." She could, he was discovering, be spectacularly quiet when she chose. She ate for 7 minutes without saying anything. He ate. The commissary had a viewport, and through it the Keth corridor's particular quality of starlight, orange adjacent, dense, moved across the table between them. She said, not looking up from her tray, "Can I ask you something personal?" He said, "Define personal." She said, about what it was like before this assignment. The other ones. He considered this for a longer moment than he usually spent on permission decisions. He said, "You may ask." She said, "Were you ever actually afraid?" In the field, with the other species. He thought about the Grethal ambush, the moon, the Velesik proximity incident, the 44-degree angle, and how close it had been. He said, "Yes." She said, "What did it feel like?" He said, clarifying. Fear in the field is clarifying. It reduces the available options and makes the correct one visible. She nodded slowly. She said, "That's what I thought." He said, "And you? In the field, are you afraid?" She said, "Yes," without hesitation, without modulation. He said, "What does it feel like for you?" She was quiet for a moment. The starlight moved. She said, "Like the options are all wrong, and I have to pick one anyway." He put down his utensil. He looked at her. He said, "How do you do it? Pick one when they're all wrong." Asterisk, she looked up from her tray and met his eyes and held them, and there's something in her face that he had no category for, something that was not readable in the way that things were supposed to be readable, but that he felt in whatever the equivalent of instinct was for a being who had spent 22 years replacing instinct with system, as clearly as a broadcast. She said, Asterisk, I decide that doing nothing is also a choice, and usually a worse one. Asterisk, she went back to her meal. He sat across from her in the commissary with the orange-adjacent starlight on the table, and his system pulling up categories and finding none of them quite right, and he thought, I do not know what I'm looking at. And then, for the first time, he thought, that was new too. He noted it. He did not delete it this time. Month 7 brought Voss something his system had never accounted for: free time. The Keth corridor inspection had concluded. The second stage negotiation had moved to a written correspondence phase that required his review, but not his active presence. The station had entered what the diplomatic corps officially called a consolidation period, the quiet between crises where experienced diplomats were supposed to rest and reflect and prepare for whatever the galaxy was building toward next. Voss had been in the Corps for 22 years, and he had spent consolidation periods reviewing case files, updating the database, running protocol simulations, and identifying the potential pressure points in any ongoing situation that might escalate while everyone else was consolidating. He did all of those things in the first 4 days. The consolidation period was 3 weeks. On the 5th day, Dr. Osei knocked on his office door and asked him what he did for fun. He said, I don't understand the question. She leaned in the doorway. Humans leaned against things a great deal. He had noticed they seemed to use surfaces as social accessories, and said, Asterisk, what do you do when you're not working? Recreation. Enjoyment. The thing you do that makes you feel like yourself. Asterisk, he said, I'm always working. She looked at him in a way that was not the reading look, and was not the diplomat look, and was something he had seen on her face occasionally in the past few months, a third look, softer edge that he had not yet built a category for. She said Voss, just his name, not Commander Kale, not said with inflection that asked for something, just his name, placed in the air between them like she was putting down something she'd been carrying. He said, What? She said, Asterisk, come on. I'm going to show you something. Asterisk, the something was the station's observation deck, which Voss had logged as existing and never visited. He understood, in the abstract, why observation decks existed. Beings across many species found value in looking at large and uncomplicated things. The psychological literature on this was substantial, and he had read the relevant sections as part of his general xenopsychology preparation. He understood it the way he understood art, as a documented phenomenon with measurable effects on social cohesion and individual cognition, important to know about, not something he had ever personally engaged with as a participant. The observation deck was mostly empty at this hour. The station was on its manufactured night cycle. The lights were low, and the viewport was the full sweep of the corridor star field, that orange-adjacent density, but from up here without a ship's hull narrowing it, it was enormous and close in a way that did something to his depth perception he hadn't expected. Dr. Osei sat on the wide ledge along the viewport, her back to the stars, and looked at him looking at the stars. He stood. He said, You come here. She said, When I can. He said, Why? She said, Asterisk, same reason you run protocol simulations, I think. It helps me hold the size of things. Reminds me what the job is actually for. Asterisk, he said, What is the job actually for? She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned and looked at the star field. She said, Asterisk, all of that. Keeping all of that from going wrong. Keeping the people in it from hurting each other more than they have to. Asterisk, more than they have to. Asterisk, not the absence of harm. The minimum necessary. He said, That is a less optimistic framing than the core mission statement. She said, The core mission statement was written by committee. He sat on the ledge, not beside her, but near. He looked at the star field. He said, It is large. She said, Yeah. They sat with the largeness for a while. He said, I have been in a great many dangerous places across that. He gestured at the viewport. I have never sat and looked at it. She said, what did you look at? He said, asterisk the situation, the parties, the exit routes. Asterisk she made a small sound, not a laugh, not quite, but adjacent to one. She said, that sounds exhausting. He said, it is the job. She said, asterisk it's part of the job. This is also the job. Asterisk she gestured at the viewport. Asterisk understanding what you're standing in the middle of. Most of the time we're so close to it we can't see it. Asterisk he looked at the stars. He thought about 69 species files. He thought about the Grethal ambush. He thought about, between us, we have a pretty good picture, and the options are all wrong, and I have to pick one anyway. He said, asterisk, when did you decide to do this? The diplomatic work. Asterisk, she said, after the thing I don't talk about in the third session of a negotiation. She said it completely straight, as if it were a normal answer to a normal question. He processed this. He said, that is a deflection. She said, asterisk, very good. Yes, it is. Asterisk, he said, you deflect less than you used to. She looked at him sharply. The reading looked but pointed. She said, you noticed that? He said, I notice most things. She held the look for a moment. Then something in her face shifted. Not dramatically, a small thing, the kind of shift he had learned to catch because she did so little of it. And she said, asterisk, there was a negotiation that didn't go well. 8 years ago, Ilvani sector, before it was pacified. I was junior, I was part of a team. The team made a recommendation, and the recommendation was wrong, and people died because of it. Asterisk, she said it without visible affect. The way he had learned to say the things he did not talk about, with the effect removed because the effect was too large to carry into a sentence, and so you said it outside the door. He said, and that is why you do this. She said, asterisk, that's why I do this, right? There's a difference. Asterisk, he sat with that for a long time. The stars moved slightly, or the station moved, the stars being stationary, and the movement being a product of the station's rotation, but the effect was that they moved. Slow, steady. He said, I've been trying to understand you for 7 months. She said, how's that going? He said, I have revised my approach 6 times, and I'm still not certain I have the right framework. She made the almost laugh sound again. She said, what framework do you have? He said, asterisk, I have stopped trying to predict what you will do. I have moved to trying to understand why you do what you do after the fact, and using that to inform future. Asterisk, he stopped. He said, asterisk, this is not a framework. This is learning. Asterisk, she looked at him. She said, yeah. He said, asterisk, I've been doing this for 22 years. I'm good at this. I do not usually learn people. I categorize them. Asterisk, she said, what's the difference? He said, asterisk, categorization is static. The category holds. Learning is. Asterisk, he stopped again. He looked at the stars. He said, asterisk, learning requires accepting that the understanding is always incomplete, that there is always more to know, that the map never becomes the territory. Asterisk, she was quiet. He said, that is uncomfortable. She said, I know. He said, you do it deliberately. She said, yes. He said, asterisk, the incompleteness, the edge cases, the throwing yourself at things. You do not do those things despite the discomfort. You do them because of it. Asterisk, she was very still. She said, why do you think that? He said, asterisk, because I have watched you for 7 months, and you are not someone who does things without understanding why. And the why for humans, the humans I have met, and the ones I have read about, and the VLSEK academic papers, and everything else, the why is always the same. You use the discomfort. You are not comfortable with comfort. You become less yourself in still water. Asterisk, the observation deck was very quiet. She said, very carefully, that is a more accurate summary of being human than I have heard from a non-human. He said, I've been paying attention. She said, I know. Then, it's terrifying, isn't it? He said, what? She said, asterisk, things that don't stay still. Things you can't fully map. Things that keep requiring new understanding. Asterisk, he looked at her. He said, yes. She said, good. And She turned back to the stars, and there was something in her profile in the starlight that his system presented no category for, and he made no attempt to build one. The crisis, when it came, arrived the way real crises always arrived, at the wrong time, with insufficient notice, and in a form that none of the preparation had quite accounted for. A Vel-SEK colony ship had been intercepted in the contested outer ring of the Keth corridor by Grethal patrol. The Grethal maintained that the colony ship had crossed into territory the second stage inspection had identified as preliminarily Grethal adjacent, a designation that was in writing genuinely ambiguous because the drafting committee had punted on 3 contentious boundary questions pending further negotiation. The Vel-SEK maintained the ship was an open corridor space. The Grethal had the ship. There were 112 Vel-SEK colony members aboard, 112 individuals, which meant, in Vel-SEK terms, something closer to 90,000 experiences happening in a single network. Voss had 40 minutes of warning before the situation went formally active. He spent them building the response protocol, who to contact, in what order, with what phrasing, what the Grethal would need to hear, and what the Vel-SEK would need to hear, and how to keep those 2 things from contradicting each other while saying them simultaneously. He was good at this. He knew exactly what he was doing. Dr. Osei knocked on his office door at minute 31. She said, "What do you need?" He said, "Asterisk, the Grethal block representative needs to hear a formal acknowledgement of their patrol authority before they will open negotiation. The Vel-SEK liaison needs to hear that the colony members are being treated in accordance with transit dignity protocols before the colony network's emotional state escalates past the point where individual communication is viable. Both of those conversations need to happen in the next 6 minutes. Asterisk," she said, "I'll take the Vel-SEK." He said, "Dr. Osei," she said, asterisk, "I know the acoustic factors. I know the colony network saturation threshold. I have the transit dignity protocols memorized. And you're better with the Grethal because they respect your history." Asterisk, he said, "How do you know they respect my history?" She said, asterisk, "You came out of the ambush on Station 9. The Grethal tracked that. It's in their military record keeping, and I read everything." Asterisk, he looked at her for exactly 1 second. He said, "Go." She went. He had the Grethal representative on a secure channel in 4 minutes. He used the formal acknowledgement language. He used the history, not gratuitously, not in the way that felt like leverage, but as a reference point, a shared thing. "I was in your spaces, and I came out, and I have been in your spaces since because I respect what lives there." The Grethal representative was not warm. The Grethal were rarely warm. But the representative opened negotiation in 6 minutes, which was technically within protocol and practically a minor miracle. Across the station, Dr. Osei was doing something with the acoustic environment of the Vel-SEK liaison's communication bay and talking to a colony network that was running at approximately 80% saturation and should not, by any standard protocol, have been responsive to individual dialogue at all. It took her 11 minutes to bring the saturation down to 50%. He watched it on the biometrics feed. It looked like talking to someone through a wall and then watching the wall get thinner. He did not know how she did it. He made a note to ask her after. The negotiation for the colony ship's release took 4 hours. He ran it. She supported, interjecting once at a moment that he had not identified as critical, but that turned out to be critical, with a single observation about the transit dignity protocol that reframed the Grethal's position as a question of honor rather than territory, which was a kind of reframe that either worked completely or collapsed everything, and, in this case, worked completely. The colony ship was released at hour 4, minute 17. 112 Vel-SEK colony members. 90,000 experiences. After the debrief and the documentation and the secure channel reports and the follow-up correspondence and the formal record of the incident that Voss would spend another 4 hours writing before he was done. After all of that, he found Dr. Osei in the commissary, sitting alone, coffee in front of her, untouched, looking at nothing. He sat down. She didn't look up. He said, "It worked." She said, "Yeah." He said, 112. She said, yeah, the coffee steamed. Neither of them touched it. He said, asterisk the VEL-SEK saturation was at 80%. Standard protocol is to not attempt individual dialogue above 60. Asterisk, she said. I know. He said, how did you bring it down? She was quiet for a moment. She said, asterisk, I told them we were still here. That's the thing the colony network loses at high saturation. The awareness that there are other entities in the space who are also trying. I just kept saying it, different ways, until it got through. Asterisk, we're still here. We're still here. We're still here. Asterisk, he sat with that. He said, and if it had not gotten through, she said, then I would have found another way. He said, you don't know that. She said, asterisk, no. But I decided it anyway. Asterisk, he looked at her. The third look, the softer one, was doing something to his expression that he was aware of and not attempting to manage. He said, why? She said, because the options were all wrong and doing nothing was worse. She finally looked up. She met his eyes. That look, the reading look, but the version that went both ways, that was not cataloging, but something more like opening, something that was uncomfortable in the particular way that large and true things are uncomfortable. She said, you're doing the thing again. He said, what thing? She said, trying to make a category. He said, yes. She said, what if he didn't? He sat with that for a long time. The commissary was quiet. The late cycle had emptied it out. He said, that is uncomfortable. She said, I know. He said, you keep saying that. She said, because it keeps being true. He breathed. An unnecessary action. His species could sustain without deliberate breath regulation, but he had developed the habit over years, using it the way humans apparently use the commissary line, as a pause, a small ritual that created a moment between the thing that happened and the response to it. He said, I have fought things across 22 years that should have broken me. She said, I know. He said, none of them did. She waited. He said, you are the most terrifying thing I have encountered in 22 years. She looked at him. He said, asterisk not because you're dangerous, because you require something my system cannot produce. And I find that I do not want to replace the system with something that can. I find I want to remain in the requiring. I don't have a word for that. Asterisk, the commissary was very quiet. She said, carefully, like she was setting something down. In English, the word is learning. He looked at her. She said, but also sometimes the word is trust. The coffee cooled between them. The stars outside the viewport were doing the thing where they moved but were not moving. He sat across from her in the quiet and did not make a category and did not try to build a framework and did not reach for the system. He stayed in the requiring. It was uncomfortable. It was the most awake he had felt in 22 years. Month 11 began with Tereth calling Voss into a private channel and telling him that the Accord Council had formally approved a new joint commission. The commission was called the Cross-Species Diplomatic Integration Framework, a name that had clearly been built by committee and had the airless quality of something no one was particularly proud of, but no one had been able to improve. Its purpose was to develop protocols for joint diplomatic response to multi-species crises. The kind of crises that the Keth Corridor colony ship situation had demonstrated were coming more frequently as the Accord expanded and species territories began to genuinely overlap for the first time. The Commission needed two co-chairs, one from the established Accord bloc, one from the human representation. Tereth said Voss's name. He said, who is the human representative? Tereth said, asterisk Dr. Ose has been proposed by the human bloc. She is not yet confirmed. Asterisk, he said, she will confirm. Tereth paused in the particular way that 60 years of xenodiplomacy produced when something interesting was happening. She said, you seem certain. He said, I am. Tereth paused again. Then, she said, asterisk Kale, are you all right? Asterisk, he said, define all right. She said, are you still using the system? He considered this carefully. He said, I'm using a different system. Tereth made a sound that translated as something between approval and concern and a very old form of amusement. She said, asterisk good. The old one was getting too rigid. I could tell from your reports. Asterisk, he said, You could tell from my reports. She said, asterisk, you write about humans differently than you write about anything else. You have for months. You write about them the way someone writes about a thing they're still in the middle of understanding. It was a good sign. I was waiting for you to notice it. Asterisk, he said, you might have mentioned it. She said, asterisk, I might have. But then you wouldn't have had to find it yourself, and that matters. Co-chair confirmation will come through official channels within 48 hours. Prepare accordingly. Asterisk, she closed the channel. Voss sat at his desk for a while. Then he went to find Dr. Osei. She was in her office, which was organized in the way all of her spaces were organized, in a manner that looked like chaos, but had a specific logic to it once you learned to see it with things grouped by urgency and relationship rather than category and alphabet. The first time he had seen her workspace, he had categorized it as disordered. 6 months later, he understood it as a different kind of order, one built around function rather than form, and he had done something in his own office that he had not examined too closely, which was shift 3 things from their standard positions to ones that were more immediately useful. She looked up when he entered. She had what appeared to be 4 documents open simultaneously on her screens, which was a thing he had learned to recognize as her processing at depth state. She went wide before she went deep, collected surface data from multiple directions before narrowing to a conclusion. She said, "You've heard about the commission." He said, "Yes." She said, "They want us to co-chair." He said, "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Is that going to be a problem?" He said, "Define problem." She said, asterisk you and me, working at that level of proximity, for what will probably be 18 months minimum. Asterisk, he stood in her office doorway. He had started leaning against door frames at some point, and he was not going to think about that right now. And said, asterisk, I've spent 11 months developing a functioning framework for working with you. An 18-month extension would allow for significant refinement of that framework. Asterisk, she looked at him the way she looked at things she was not sure were completely serious. She said, "That is the least human way anyone has ever expressed that sentiment." He said, "I'm not human." She said, asterisk, no. "But you've picked up some of the vocabulary." Asterisk, he said, "Have I?" She said, asterisk, he said, framework. "You used to say system." Asterisk, he considered this. He said, asterisk, a framework allows for revision. A system assumes completion. Asterisk, she was very still. He said, asterisk, I am not finished. Revising. Asterisk, she looked at him with a third look, the one he had never built a category for, and had stopped trying to. She said, neither am I. He said, asterisk, then yes. Co-chair. No problem. Asterisk, she turned back to her screens. She said, without looking up, asterisk, for the record, I was going to confirm regardless. I just want to know if you've been consulted. Asterisk, he said. I know. She looked up sharply. He said, asterisk, you always know who's been consulted before you confirm. You consider the structure of a decision before you participate in it. You have done this consistently for 11 months. Asterisk, she stared at him. She said, how long have you known that? He said, for months. She said, and you didn't say anything. He said, I was still developing the framework. Something crossed her face. Not the reading look. Not the diplomat look. Not the third look. Something he had not cataloged before. Something that was warm and frustrated and amused all at the same time, layered the way she layered everything simultaneous currents. She said, Voss. He said, yes. She said, you are also, for the record, the most terrifying thing I have encountered in 11 months. He said nothing for a moment. Then, define terrifying. She said, asterisk, you see things. Precisely. And you don't use what you see to control the situation. You just hold it, like it's enough to know something without needing to do something with it. Asterisk, he said, is that not normal? She said, asterisk, for humans? Absolutely not. We are constitutionally incapable of knowing something without immediately needing to act on it. It makes us very productive and also exhausting. Asterisk, he said. I had noticed both. She made the almost laugh sound, the real one this time, the one that moved all the way up to her eyes. She said, asterisk, okay. Co-chair. Framework revision. 18 months. Let's go do this thing. Asterisk, he said. Yes. The first session of the Cross-Species Diplomatic Integration Framework Commission was attended by 23 representatives across 11 species and ran for 6 hours. Voss ran the opening and the formal agenda. Dr. Osei handled what she called the room. The temperature of it, the social pressure points, the moments when one party was starting to close off and needed a reframe before they did. He gave her the floor for those moments without requiring a formal request, and she took it without requiring permission. And after the third time, the Al-Vani representative leaned to the person beside him and said something in the formal register that Voss's translator got as they are well matched, which was the Al-Vani way of saying something considerably more complimentary. In a lunch recess, a junior VLSEK observer, young, clearly new to formal diplomatic spaces, running with the particular overwhelm of colony network saturation that came with being a young network member in a high-stimulus environment, approached Dr. Osei and asked her in trade standard how she knew when she had done enough. The question was clearly about more than the session. It was about the impossible scope of what they were all trying to do, the whole impossible project of species that had not been built for each other, trying to build something together anyway. Dr. Osei looked at the young VLSEK observer. She said, asterisk, I don't. So I just keep going until something works. Asterisk, the VLSEK observer processed this. The observer said, does that not frighten you? Dr. Osei said, asterisk, yes. But I decided that being frightened of it was less useful than being in it. Asterisk, Voss, standing 3 feet away, heard this and felt something resolve in him the way a long-standing structural question resolves when a missing piece arrives. Not a dramatic thing, a quiet thing is settling. He had spent 11 months trying to understand what humans were doing when they walked into the impossible. He had thought it was recklessness. Then he thought it was trained competency. Then he thought it was something philosophical, a decision made once about the acceptable relationship to discomfort. He had been refining the framework the whole time, and the framework kept being incomplete. I decided that being frightened of it was less useful than being in it. Asterisk, it was not the absence of fear. It was not even the management of fear. It was a decision made repeatedly in the moment to orient toward the thing rather than away from it. A choice made by beings who knew they were afraid and went anyway. Not because the fear went away. Not because the situation became safe. Because the alternative, stopping, not doing, the absence of action in a universe that was always in motion, was worse. That was the thing he had not been able to categorize. It was not a trait. It was not a skill. It was not even a philosophy, exactly. It was a practice, a thing done over and over until it became a way of being, until the decision to move toward was more automatic than the impulse to move away. It was terrifying. He was beginning to understand, also something he had been doing for 11 months without naming it. That night, on the observation deck, it had become their place, the way things become places, not by decision, but by repetition. Voss told Dr. Osei what he had resolved. She listened. She had gotten very good at listening to him in the way that did not rush the ending. She had learned the rhythm of how he arrived at things, which required the full journey rather than the shortcut, and she never tried to shortcut it. This was, he had come to understand, also a form of what he had tried to categorize for 11 months. The practice of staying with something until it finished arriving. When he finished, she said, so, he said, asterisk, so, I have been doing the human thing without knowing it was the human thing. Asterisk, she said, what's the human thing? He said, asterisk, choosing toward, despite the fear. Repeatedly. Asterisk, she looked at him. She said, you've been doing that for 22 years. He said, asterisk, no. I have been doing this system for 22 years. The system eliminates fear by eliminating the unknown. The system maps, categorizes, predicts. It is not choosing toward. It is engineering around. Asterisk, she said. And now. He said, now I am an 11-month revision of everything I thought I knew, and I cannot predict the outcome, and I have not stopped. She said, yeah, he said, that is the human thing. She said, yeah. The stars moved, or the station moved. The effect was the same. He said, It is uncomfortable, she said. Every time. He said, asterisk, you said that early on, when I was still trying to build the right framework. You said it keeps being true. Asterisk, she said. It does, he said. I have a different relationship to that now. She looked at him. She said, what kind of relationship? He said, asterisk, I used to understand the discomfort as a signal that something was wrong. An error state. Now I understand it as a signal that something is still open, still becoming. The discomfort is not the warning. The discomfort is the information. Asterisk, she was quiet for a long moment. She said, Voss, that is a better description of the thing than I have heard from a human. He said, I've been paying attention. She said, I know. They sat with the stars for a while. He had stopped looking for exit routes when he was with her. He had noticed this around month 8 and had not changed it back. He said, I want to ask you something. She said, okay. He said, asterisk, the thing from 8 years ago. The negotiation that did not go well. The thing you don't talk about in the 3rd session. Asterisk, she went very still. Not a Grethal still. Not a Velesik still. Her own kind of still, the kind that was not absence but the opposite presence so concentrated it stopped moving. She said, yes. He said, you do not have to tell me. She said, I know. She looked at the stars. Asterisk, we were trying to evacuate a research outpost. There were 42 researchers and the transport window was 6 hours and we had 2 ships that could do it. The recommendation we made, my team's recommendation, was to split the groups and run 2 trips. The math said that was the fastest option. Asterisk, she stopped. He said nothing. He waited. She said, asterisk, the math didn't account for a patrol pattern that had changed since the last survey. The second ship got 3/4 of the way out, and it didn't make it. Asterisk, the stars moved. Didn't move. She said, 19 people. He said, the math was wrong. She said, asterisk, the math was right. Our information was wrong. There's a difference, but it doesn't feel like one. Asterisk, he said. No, she said. Asterisk, after that I read everything. Every survey, every patrol record, every Velesik academic paper, every piece of secondary information I can find. Because I know now that the map is never the territory and that the gap between them is where people die. Asterisk, he said, and you keep going anyway. She said, asterisk, 19 people. 42 people. Every single time I walk into a situation where the math might be wrong, I'm choosing between the possibility of 19 more and the certainty of everyone else if I don't try. Asterisk, he said, that is not a comfortable place to operate from. She said, no, he said, you do it every time. She said, I do it every time. He breathed. The deliberate, unnecessary breath. He said, asterisk, that is not recklessness. That is not untrained instinct. That is not the throwing yourself at things. Asterisk, she said. No, he said, asterisk, that is the most precise thing I've seen. In 22 years, asterisk, she looked at him. The starlight was doing something to the edges of her in a way that was not about visual information. He had cataloged approximately 940 moments with this woman in 11 months. He was not going to stop. He said, you terrified me because you did not match any existing pattern. She said, I know. He said, you still don't. She said, no, he said, I do not want you to. She was quiet. He said, asterisk, I have been in a great many dangerous places. I have learned a great many things about how to survive them. And the most dangerous thing I have encountered, the thing that has revised everything, is the possibility of a map that is always growing, always requiring new information, never completing. Asterisk, she said, that's the relationship, Voss. He said, yes. She said, to the work. He said, yes. She was quiet for one more moment. She said, and to, he said, yes. The stars moved. They sat in the movement. He said, I do not have a word in my language for choosing towards something that cannot be mapped in advance. She said, in mine, the word depends on the thing you're choosing toward. He said, what are the options? She looked at him. The full look. The one that went both ways. She said, asterisk, faith, hope, love, depending. Asterisk, he sat with those words in the quiet of the observation deck on the station in the middle of the corridor that had nearly started a war and hadn't. He said, "In my language, all three are the same word." She said, "What's the word?" He said it. His language did not render in trade standard. It was not designed for that, but the shape of it was something between a held note and an opening door. She listened to it. She said, "That's a good word." He said, "It requires constant revision." She said, "Yeah." He said, "It is uncomfortable." She said, "Every time." He said, "I have decided that being uncomfortable with it is less useful than being in it." She looked at him for a long time. The reading look and the third look and something new, all running at once, layers over layers in the way she layered everything. She said, "There it is." He said, "Yes, there it was. 22 years, 69 species. The Grethal ambush and the Velesike proximity incident and the moon he did not talk about and the corridor negotiation and the colony ship and the commission and the observation deck and the commissary coffee and the 43 minutes of silence and the 7 words he had not caught fast enough and all of it building toward the moment where the system became a framework and the framework became something that did not have a clean name in any language he had ever learned, but that he was now, for the first time, operating inside of rather than trying to map from outside. He had fought monsters across the galaxy, and none of them had broken him. And the human sitting beside him on the observation deck ledge had not broken him either. She had done something else, something the system had no category for, something the framework was still learning to hold, something that required all of him, not just the 22 years of expertise and the 69 species files and the protocol manuals and the pattern recognition, but the parts underneath those things that he had spent 22 years systematizing over. She had made him choose toward, and he was not going to stop. He looked at the stars. He felt the station's slow rotation, the movement that was not the stars moving. He sat beside the most terrifying thing he had encountered in 22 years of a life built for impossible rooms, and he did not reach for the system, and he did not build a new category, and he did not look for the exit. He stayed. It was uncomfortable. He had decided that was the right place to be.